The whole valley remembered the summer the gardens died. They remembered the beetles that fell like dark rain, the rows of cabbage gnawed to lace, the families who packed wagons and left. But mostly they remembered the woman they had laughed at, the one who set a steaming pot of green-flecked dumplings on her table and fed every hungry mouth that came knocking. Years before, on a bright April morning, Hannah Voss knelt at the edge of her kitchen garden and pulled what her neighbor called filth from between the bean rows. Her husband, Peter, watched from the fence. "You can't build a life on what grows where it pleases," he said, not unkindly. Hannah held up a fistful of tender lamb's quarters. "Maybe a life isn't only what you plant," she answered. "Maybe it's also what you're willing to see." Peter laughed and went to mend the gate. The Voss farm sat in a shallow bowl of land in eastern Pennsylvania, the year 1887, where the soils was good but the margins were thin. Peter and Hannah had married 4 springs earlier and bought the place with money saved and money borrowed, and the borrowed part sat heavier on Peter's mind than he liked to admit. He was a careful man, broad through the shoulders, with a farmer's faith that order and labor would always be rewarded. He plowed straight rows. He kept his ledgers in a neat hand. He believed in cabbages and potatoes and field corn, in the things a man could count and sell. Hannah believed in those too. But she had grown up the daughter of a midwife who walked the hedgerows with a basket, and she had learned young that the land offered more than the parts people had agreed to value. She knew where the wild onions clustered along the creek, their slender green stalks sharp and bright. She knew the broad soft leaves of lamb's quarters and the fat juicy stems of purslane that crept low through the warm dirt. She knew dandelion, bitter and good, and nettles that stung the careless hand, but cooked down sweet and dark as spinach. Their nearest neighbors were the Ackermans, who farmed the adjoining quarter section and never missed a chance to comment. Greta Ackerman had a tongue like a paring knife and a deep certainty about how a respectable household ought to run. Her husband, Otto, echoed whatever she said a beat later, like a slow bell. "She picks weeds," Greta told the women at the church social, not bothering to lower her voice. "Cooks them right up and serves them to that poor man. Weeds. Like they haven't a thing in their cellar." They did have things in their cellar, jars and crocks and braided onions, but they also had Hannah's greens on the table most nights, wilted in bacon fat or folded into dumplings, and Peter ate them because they were good and because his wife had made them, even as he wished she'd be a little less peculiar about it where folks could see. "It's only that they talk," he said to her one evening, gentle. "I don't mind the eating. I mind the talking." "Let them talk," Hannah said, drying a bowl. Talk never fed anybody, but she saw the worry sitting on him, and she wished she could lift it. In the third week of June, Otto Ackerman came across the field at a near run, his hat in his hand, and that alone told Peter something was wrong. Otto was not a man who hurried. "Beetles," he said when he reached the fence, breathing hard. "Striped ones and the dark humped kind. They've come up through the Schneider place, Anton Lutz's. Whole rows gone overnight. Hansel Schneider says he's never seen the like. A carpet of them moving." Peter felt something cold settle under his ribs. He looked past Otto, toward his own neat acres, his cabbages standing fat and green and innocent in the morning light. "How far off?" he asked. "A mile, maybe less." Otto twisted his hat. "Greta's got the children beating pans in the rows. I don't know that it helps. I don't know that anything helps." He looked at Peter. "God keep us." That night Peter sat at the kitchen table with his ledger open and did not write in it. The lamp threw his shadow large against the wall. Hannah moved quietly behind him, banking the fire, and she let him sit with it because she knew he needed to. "We could try the lime," he said finally. "Hansel's spreading lime and ash. And there's the Paris green powder they sell in town, the arsenic stuff. Burns the leaves some, but it kills them." "It kills more than them," Hannah said. "It'd be in the soil, in what we eat after." "What we eat after," Peter repeated, and gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "If there's anything to eat after." He pressed his thumbs against his eyes. The whole crop's pledged against the note, Hannah. The cabbages, the potatoes, the corn we'd sell come fall. If the beetles take it, I don't see how we make the payment. I don't see how we keep the place. Hannah pulled a chair beside him and sat. Outside, the dark was full of the small sounds of summer, crickets in the creek, indifferent to their trouble. Then we fight for the crop, she said. We do what Hansel does, the lime and the ash, the pans, the picking by hand. We try everything that might work. I'm not saying give it up, she paused, but I'm saying that if it fails despite everything, we won't starve. I want you to hold that. Whatever happens out there in the rows, we are not going to go hungry. On weeds, Peter said. It came out sharper than he meant it. On food, she said evenly. On food that grows whether the beetles come or not, because they don't bother with it. They want your tender cabbage. They don't touch the lamb's quarters at the field edge. They leave the purslane be. The nettles down by the creek will stand there green all summer, eating or no eating. He looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to believe in his rows, in lime and labor, and the straightforward arithmetic of a man who works hard. He had built his whole notion of himself on that arithmetic, and here was his wife offering him a different sum, one that made him feel obscurely that he had failed at the simple thing. I'll fight the crop first, he said at last. I'll try every honest thing. Of course you will, Hannah said, and I'll be right beside you in the rows. But let me keep the creek bank, too. Let me keep my baskets ready. He nodded slowly. It was not quite agreement. It was not quite refusal either, so they fought. For 10 days, Peter and Hannah were in the gardens before the dew burned off and out again after supper until the light failed. They spread wood ash until their hands were gray with it. They mixed lime and dusted the rows. They walked the cabbages plant by plant, picking the beetles into pails of water. The children from 3 farms hired on to help for pennies and bread. Peter's back ached in a deep grinding way he'd never known. Hannah's fingers cracked and bled at the tips. They did everything a careful, hard-working, faithful couple could do, and for a few days it seemed it might be enough, the rows holding, the greens standing. Peter let himself hope. Hannah, quietly, kept her baskets by the door. It was during those days that old Mrs. Brunner came to matter. She lived alone in a slumped little house at the valley's mouth, a widow past 80, half-blind, kept alive mostly by the charity of neighbors who could spare little. Hannah had always carried her a share, a jar of soup, a loaf. Now, walking back from the creek with a basket of greens, Hannah found the old woman on her step, hungry, the charity thin because everyone's fear had turned them inward. They say the beetles are coming, Mrs. Brunner quavered. They say we'll all be hungry. Not all, Hannah said and sat down beside her. The beetles came on a Thursday. They did not come the way a storm comes, with warning in the sky. They came up out of the ground and down through the air at once, and by mid-morning the Voss cabbages were furred with them, the striped backs and the humped dark backs crawling over every leaf, and the picking by hand was like trying to empty the creek with a spoon. Peter stood at the edge of his rows with a pail in each hand and watched a week of plants disappear into lace in front of his eyes, and something in his face closed like a door. Keep picking, he said hoarsely, and they picked. But by evening, the futility of it had soaked into all of them, and the children's mothers came to fetch them home, and Peter and Hannah stood alone in the wreck of the garden in the long gold light. That's the cabbage gone, Peter said. They'll have the potatoes next, and the corn after. Hannah took one of the pails from his hand. Then come inside, she said. You haven't eaten since morning. Whatever else is true, you have to eat. He followed her in because he had no fight left to do otherwise. He sat heavily at the table while she washed her hands and tied on her apron, and he watched her with the dull eyes of a man who has stopped expecting good news. What he saw over the next half hour was his wife turn almost nothing into supper. She had a basket from that morning. He'd half noticed it by the door and thought nothing of it. Now she emptied it onto the scrubbed table. A great soft heap of lamb's quarters, the leaves gray-green and tender, a tangle of purslane, fat-stemmed and glistening, a fistful of wild onions, white bulbs trenching green, and wrapped careful in a damp cloth so they wouldn't sting her, a bundle of young nettle tops. She set a pot of water to boil. She cut a little salt pork into a skillet and let it render, the good smell of it filling the kitchen. And Peter's stomach turned over with a hunger he'd been too sick at heart to feel. Into the hot fat she threw the wild onions, and when they went soft and sweet, she added the nettles first, because they took the longest, stirring them down until the sting cooked clean out of them, and they went dark and silky. Then the lamb's quarters by the handful, wilting to a quarter their size, and last the purslane, which kept a little of its crispness and a bright lemony tang, salt, a grind of pepper from the tin, a splash of vinegar from the crock at the end, to lift it all. She set the skillet in the middle of the table and put a spoon in it, and said nothing at all. She simply sat down across from him and waited. Peter looked at the greens. He looked at his wife. He thought of Greta Ackerman's voice at the church social. She cooks them right up and serves them to that poor man, and he felt the old hot shame rise in him. And then he was so hungry, and it smelled so good, and he was so tired of being a proud man in a failing field, that he picked up the spoon and ate. It was wonderful. That was the thing he could not get past, sitting there in the ruin of his year. It was not poverty food choked down for want of better. It was savory and deep and faintly sweet, the onions and the pork and the dark-cooked greens, and the bright sour snap of the vinegared purslane cutting through. He ate a second helping. He mopped the skillet with a heel of bread. "You picked this," he said slowly, "this morning before they even." "I pick every morning," Hannah said. "I have for years. You just never had reason to be glad of it before." Peter set down the bread. For a long moment he didn't speak, and when he did his voice was rough. "I've been a fool about it," he said. "About the talking. I let the talking matter more than." He gestured at the empty skillet, at the warmth in his own belly, at the two of them alive and fed at their own table while the garden died outside. "More than this. You weren't a fool," Hannah said. "You're a man who likes the world to make sense. There's no shame in that." She reached across and covered his gray, ash-stained hand with her own cracked one. "But the world doesn't always, and when it doesn't, you'd best know how to eat your weeds." For the first time in 10 days, Peter laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. "Teach me then," he said. So she taught him. In the days that followed, the beetles moving on through the valley, gardens going bare from one end to the other, the whole bowl of land filling with a low chorus of despair. The Voss kitchen became the busiest place for a mile. Hannah taught Peter where to look and what to take, and to her quiet delight he proved a good student, ranging the field edges and the creek bank with a basket and bringing back what he found for her judgment. "That's good," she'd say, picking through his haul. "That's good, that's good. No, leave that, that's nothing, it'll only make you sick. But this." She'd hold up a sprig. "This is dandelion before it flowers. Bitter as a sermon if you boil it wrong. Watch." She showed him to boil the dandelion greens in 2 changes of water to take the worst bite out. Then dress them warm with the bacon fat and a little vinegar and a slip of the wild onion. She showed to make the herb dumplings that became, before the summer was out, the thing the whole valley begged for. Lamb's quarters and nettles chopped fine and wrung dry in a cloth, worked into a dough of flour and egg and a spoon of fat, rolled into little dense green-flecked balls and dropped into simmering broth until they bobbed up light and tender. He could not believe the first time he ate one that it had been weeds an hour before. She made soups that stretched a single bone 3 days, a long-simmered broth, an onion, a potato if they had one to spare, and then handful after handful of greens thrown in at the end, so the pot went rich and green and filling. She set up crocks along the cellar wall and packed them with the tougher stems, the purslane stalks, the thick bottoms of the wild onions, covered in vinegar and salt, so that in the lean weeks of late summer there'd be a sharp, bright pickle to wake up a dull plate. And the food was good. That was what undid people, in the end. They could have borne being fed grudgingly out of charity. What they could not get over was that the Voss table, in a summer when everyone's proper crops had failed, set food that people actually wanted to eat. It began with Mrs. Brunner. Hannah had been carrying greens down to the old woman all along, and now she carried dumplings and soup. And Mrs. Brunner, who had a long memory and an old hill country childhood, whipped the first time she tasted the skillet greens and said it was her own mother's table come back to her after 60 years. My mother fed 8 children on the field edges, the old woman said, gumming a dumpling with enormous satisfaction. There wasn't a weed she couldn't make a meal of. Folks forgot. Folks got proud and forgot. She fixed her milky eyes more or less on Hannah. You didn't forget. Word traveled the way it does. A child sent to fetch something came home talking about the green dumplings at the Voss place. A neighbor, ashamed and hungry, came at dusk to ask, hat in hand, whether it was true a body could eat the lamb's quarters at the field edge, and how a body might cook it. Hannah fed him at her table, then sent him home with a basket and instructions. She turned no one away. This was the thing that struck Peter most, watching his wife those weeks. She had every right to a bitter satisfaction. These were the same people who'd laughed, whose wives had clucked over her peculiarity at the church social. A harder person would have made them feel it. Hannah only made them welcome. She stood Greta Ackerman herself at the stove one afternoon and showed her, hand over hand, how to wring the nettles dry. And if there was a glint of something in Hannah's eye, she kept it to a glint. Why? Peter asked her one night when the kitchen was finally quiet. After all of it, the way they talked. Hannah scraped the last of the greens into a bowl for the morning. Because hungry is hungry, she said. It doesn't care who laughed. And because, she thought about it, because the knowing isn't mine to hoard. My mother gave it to me. Somebody gave it to her. It's only worth anything if it keeps moving. She set the bowl in the cellar. Besides, a thing you share comes back to you. It always has. Peter didn't know yet how true that would prove. He only knew that he loved her, plainly and entirely, in a way that had somehow gotten clearer the poorer they'd become. He went to bank the fire, and outside the bare ruined gardens lay quiet under the stars, and inside there was enough. At the end of July, the County Agricultural Society held its summer meeting in the town hall, and the talk was all of the beetle and the ruined gardens and the hard winter coming. A man from the state college spoke gravely of losses. And then, almost as an afterthought, the society's secretary mentioned a curious thing, that out in the valley a farm wife had kept not only her own household but half her neighbors fed off the wild greens of the field edges, and was that not worth a look? People turned in their seats. Someone said the name, Voss. Hannah, who had come only to buy thread and had slipped in at the back, felt every eye in the hall swing toward her and felt the ground shift under her feet. The attention, it turned out, was not all kindly. There is a kind of person who cannot bear to be proven wrong, and the valley had its share. Greta Ackerman, who had stood at Hannah's stove and learned to wring nettles, told a different story now that the whole county was listening. It hadn't been so remarkable, Greta let it be known. Anybody could pick weeds, and was it altogether wholesome? Feeding folk on ditch growth and creek scum. She'd heard of people taking sick. She'd heard the lamb's quarters drew up something poison from the soil. She wasn't saying mind. She was only saying what she'd heard. Hannah might have weathered Greta's tongue. She'd weathered it for years. What she could not so easily weather was that other people, frightened and proud and looking for a reason not to feel grateful, took the story up. It was easier to whisper that the Voss greens were dangerous than to admit you'd eaten at the table of the woman you'd mocked. Within a week or two, the tide that had been running toward the Voss kitchen began, in places, to run the other way. It came to a head when the Lutz baby took sick. The child had been poorly for days, a summer fever, the kind that swept through every August, and sometimes carried off the little ones no matter what anyone did. But the Lutzes had been eating Hannah's greens, like half the valley. and in their fear and grief, they reached for the nearest thing to blame. "It's the weeds," Frau Lutz said, wild-eyed to anyone who'd listen. "She gave us the weeds, and now my baby's burning up. That woman and her ditch food." The accusation was monstrous, and it was unfair, and it spread like the beetles had spread, fast and ugly. Peter came in from the field one evening to find Hannah standing very still in the middle of the kitchen, a letter in her hand, a note unsigned that told her she ought to be ashamed, poisoning Christian families, and that the valley would be better off if the Voss place went under after all. "They can't think it," Peter said, taking the note from her. His hand was shaking with anger. "They sat at this table. They ate and thanked you." "They're frightened," Hannah said, but her voice was thin. "A baby's sick. People have to lay it somewhere." She sat down. For the first time all summer, Peter saw her look truly shaken, and it frightened him more than the beetles had. Hannah had been the steady one. Hannah had been the one who held. "The Greens never hurt anybody," he said. "You know what you're doing. Your mother before you." "I know it," Hannah said, "but knowing it doesn't stop the talk. And if they believe it," she stopped. "Peter, if they believe the food is poison, then everything I did this summer turns to a curse in their mouths. Every basket, every bowl I carried to Mrs. Brunner." Her voice cracked on the old woman's name. "What if they tell her not to eat? She's all alone down there. She'd starve sooner than touch something they called poison." That was the thing that got her up out of the chair. Not the note, not her own good name. The thought of the old widow at the valley's mouth, half blind, frightened off the one food keeping her alive by a rumor. "I have to go to her," Hannah said. "Tonight. It's near dark. Then I'll take the lantern." She was already reaching for her shawl. "I won't have that old woman scared into starving on my account. Not while I can walk down there and sit with her and eat a bowl of it in front of her so she sees it's safe." Peter caught her hand at the door. "I'm coming with you." They went down the valley road together in the blue dusk, the lantern swinging, the bare gardens on either side gone gray and ghostly. And Hannah, who had not let the talk touch her all summer, walked fast and silent with her jaw set. And Peter understood that the laughing he'd dreaded so long ago had never had the power to break her. Only this could, only being made into the very thing she'd fought, a danger instead of a help. They found Mrs. Brunner's house dark, and Hannah's heart dropped. But the old woman was only sitting in the unlit front room because she'd run low on lamp oil and couldn't see to use it. Anyway, she was glad of them. She had heard nothing of the rumor. She heard little of anything down at the valley's mouth. And when Hannah, half laughing with relief, explained why they'd come hurrying through the dusk, Mrs. Brunner snorted with surprising vigor. "Poison," she said. "I've eaten off the field edges 80 years, and here I sit. You tell them that. You tell them Wilhelmina Brunner says they're fools." They stayed and shared a bowl with her by lantern light, and it should have eased Hannah's heart. And it did a little. But on the walk home the worry crept back, because Mrs. Brunner's good health was an argument, and frightened people don't listen to arguments. They listen to fear, and the fear was loose in the valley now, and Hannah didn't know how to call it back. The next days were the hardest of the whole summer. The baskets stopped going out, mostly, folk too proud or too scared to come, and Hannah too uncertain now to press it on anyone. The Lutz baby hung between sick and well. If the child died, Hannah knew, the rumor would harden into fact in people's minds, and no amount of truth would soften it again. She found she could not sleep. She lay listening to the crickets and turning it over, the unfairness of it, the way a whole summer's quiet work could be poisoned by a frightened mother's grief and a jealous neighbor's tongue. Peter watched her wear thin and could do nothing, and it galled him. He had spent the early summer wishing his wife were less peculiar. Now he'd have given anything to take the valley by its collective caw-collar and make it see her the way he saw her. He tried in his blunt way. He spoke up at the feed store when he heard the talk, told them flat that he'd eaten the greens every day for 2 months and was the healthiest he'd ever been. He told them Mrs. Brunner's words. Some listened, some looked at the floor. Otto Ackerman, to his credit, took Peter's side. It's good food, I had it myself, and earned a sharp look from Greta for it. But blunt, honest argument is a poor weapon against fear, and Peter felt it glance off. Then, on the fourth or fifth day, two things happened close together. The first was that the Lutz baby's fever broke. The child sat up, took milk, and was, within a day, plainly going to live, and the doctor from town, who'd seen the baby twice, said plainly to anyone who asked that it had been a common summer fever, and had nothing whatever to do with anybody's cooking, that you could not get such a fever from greens any more than from good cabbage, and that the talk was nonsense and ought to stop. The doctor was respected. His word carried where Peter's had not. The second thing was quieter and mattered more. Mrs. Brunner, 80 and half blind and not one to be told what to eat, got herself up the valley road. Nobody quite knew how she managed it. She had not walked so far in years. But she appeared one morning at the church, where the women gathered to put up the last of what little the gardens had given, and she stood in the doorway with her stick and her milky eyes, and she told them, in a voice that carried, exactly what she thought of grown people who'd let their neighbor feed them all summer, and then turned and called her a poisoner the moment they got frightened. That woman walked down to my house in the dark, the old widow said, because she was afeard I'd be too scared to eat and starve, in the dark, to sit with me. And you call her a danger. You ought to be ashamed clear through. It was the bee story coming back around, though no one in that doorway would have called it such. It was the kindness Hannah had given the old woman, weeks before any of this, returning now with interest at the exact moment it was most needed. The doorway was very quiet, and then, one by one, the women began to look ashamed. But Hannah didn't know any of that yet. While Mrs. Brunner was speaking her piece at the church, Hannah was home, and there she had her lowest hour. A second note had come, crueler than the first, and she had read it and let it fall, and she stood in her kitchen among the crocks and baskets that had been her summer's whole work, and felt, for the first time, that perhaps it had all been worthless, that you could feed people and still be hated for it, that kindness was no shield, that she'd been a fool to think the knowing was worth sharing if this was what sharing bought. She sat down at the cold hearth and put her face in her cracked hands and did not weep quite but came near it. Peter found her there. He didn't say anything clever, because he wasn't a clever man. He sat down on the hearthstone beside her and put his arm around her and let her lean. I keep thinking of my mother, Hannah said at last into the quiet, walking the hedges with her basket. People respected her. They came to her when the babies came. And here I am made into a poisoner for the same kind of knowing. She drew a shaking breath. Maybe Greta's right. Maybe it's not respectable. Maybe I should have just let our crop fail like everyone's and gone hungry, decent and quiet, and not made myself a spectacle. No, Peter said. No, no, he turned her cracked hand over in his. I spent 2 months ashamed of the talking. Hannah, and you know what I learned? The talking's nothing. It's wind. You fed half this valley off ground they walked past every day for years and never saw. You fed Mrs. Brunner. You fed me. Not just my belly. You taught me to see a field I thought I already knew. His voice roughened. A frightened woman with a sick baby said an unfair thing, and a jealous one made it worse. That's all the talk is. It's not the truth of you. The truth of you is the warmest thing I ever sat down to. Hannah was quiet a long moment. You've gotten almost poetic, she said, for a man who plants in straight rows. Don't tell anyone, Peter said, and felt her finally almost laugh. What got Hannah up off the hearth was not the comfort. In the end, though the comfort helped. It was a thought that arrived underneath it, plain and clear. Mrs. Brunner is still down there alone, and if anyone's frightened her off her food, she'll need me, and I'm sitting here feeling sorry for myself while an old woman might be going hungry. The work wasn't done. The talk could say what it liked. The old woman still had to eat. Hannah wiped her face, stood and reached for a basket. Whatever the valley believed, she knew what she knew. She would go on knowing it and feeding people with it. She had her shawl half on when the knock came. She opened the door, expecting another note, another hard word, and found instead her own dim front yard full of people. Otto Ackerman stood nearest, hat in hand. Behind him were the Lutzes, Frau Lutz with the baby on her hip, the child pink-cheeked and plainly mending, and the Schneiders, and 3 or 4 other families from up and down the valley. And at the front of them all, leaning on her stick, the unmistakable small bent shape of Wilhelmina Brunner, who had apparently decided that having shamed the church, she would now see the job through. For a moment, nobody said anything. Hannah stood in the doorway with her basket on her arm, and her shawl crooked and her face still blotched from the pleafer hearth, and she could not, for the life of her, read what was coming. Then Frau Lutz stepped forward. She was crying, and she didn't bother to hide it. The fever broke, she said. The doctor says, he says it was never the food. It was never your food. It was a summer fever, the same that took my sister's boy 2 years back. And I knew that, I knew it, her voice broke. I needed it to be somebody's fault, and I made it yours. And you'd fed us all summer. She pressed the baby's cheek to her own. There's no forgiving that, but I've come to ask it anyway. Hannah set the basket down slowly on the step. And I told them, Mrs. Brunner put in, before Hannah could find words, what I think of the lot of them. At the church, you should have seen their faces. She sounded enormously pleased. 80 years I've eaten off the field edges, and they call you a poisoner. I set them straight. She did, Otto said with feeling. She surely did. He turned his hat in his hands. Greta's not here. Greta'll come round in her own time, or she won't. But the rest of us talked, and we wanted to say it to your face and not behind your back, the way it was said before. He looked up and met Hannah's eyes, which was hard for him. We were wrong about you, Frau Voss. We laughed, and then we ate, and then we let ourselves be turned against you the minute we got scared. That's a poor way to treat the one neighbor who fed us when the gardens went bare. We're sorry for it. Peter had come up behind Hannah in the doorway. She felt his hand come to rest on her shoulder, steadying, and she was glad of it, because the ground felt unsteady again. But a different unsteadiness this time, the kind that comes not from a blow, but from setting down a weight you've carried so long you'd forgotten it was heavy. I don't know what to say, Hannah said honestly. Say you'll teach us proper, Mrs. Brunner said, before the knowing dies out with the likes of me. That's the thing worth doing. Never mind the sorries. Sorries are cheap. Teach them. And that, in the end, was what Hannah did. The hard winter everyone had feared came on schedule. The gardens had failed too completely for anyone to put up a proper store, and the cellars up and down the valley were thin. But it was a different winter than it would have been, because all through the late summer and the fall, Hannah Voss had kept her kitchen open and her knowledge moving. She showed them all of it, where the greens hid, and how to tell the good from the worthless, how to dry lamb's quarters and nettles in the rafters so there'd be something green, to throw in a soup in February, how to pack the crocks with vinegar-pickled stems that kept crisp and sharp through the cold months, how to make the herb dumplings stretch a little flour and a little fat into a supper that filled a family and made them glad. The valley ate, not richly. It was a hard winter, and there was no pretending otherwise, but no family in that bowl of land went truly hungry, and more than one farmer admitted, over a bowl of green soup with the snow piling against the window, that he'd never have credited it in June, that the thing that carried them through was not the proper crop they'd pledged their year to, but the wild stuff at the field edges they'd spent their whole lives walking past. Peter made the note payment in the fall. It was tighter than he liked. They sold what little the beetles had spared, and a calf they'd meant to keep. But they made it, and they kept the place. And somewhere in there, Peter stopped thinking of it as a near thing he'd survived, and started thinking of it as the year he'd learned to see his own land. He took to going out with a basket himself, unembarrassed now, and more than once Hannah looked up from the stove to find her careful husband, the man who planted in straight rows, coming in pleased as a boy with a find of late purslane. By the next spring, The Agricultural Society had asked Hannah to speak. She stood up in the town hall, where she'd once felt every eye swing toward her like an accusation. And this time the eyes were something else. Curious, respectful, a few of them ashamed and grateful both. She was no orator. She simply told them what she knew, plainly the way her mother had told it to her. That the land gives more than the parts we've agreed to value, that there is food at the edges of every field for anyone humble enough to learn it, that you need not go hungry while green things grow, even the green things no one planted. My husband told me once, she said near the end, and found Peter's face in the crowd, that you can't build a life on what grows where it pleases. She smiled. I've been thinking about that for a year now, and I believe he had it backwards. I believe a life is mostly that, the things that come unbidden, that you didn't plant and can't predict, the trouble and the kindness both. The question isn't whether you can keep it to neat rows. You can't. The question is whether you've learned to see what's already there, and make a supper of it, and set out enough chairs. The hall was quiet. Then, somewhere in the back, old Mrs. Brunner thumped her stick on the floor in approval, and the whole room laughed, and the laughing this time was the good kind. Years later, when the valley remembered the summer the gardens died, they remembered it strangely, the way people remember the hardships that turned out to be gifts. Almost fondly, almost as luck. The beetles had come, and the proper crops had failed, and the winter had been lean, all true. But what they told their children was different. They told them about the woman who fed the valley off the field edges, who walked down a dark road to keep a frightened old widow eating, who was laughed at and then was right. And in more than one kitchen in that bowl of land, when the spring greens came up green and free at the edges of the gardens, somebody went out with a basket and remembered Hannah Voss and was grateful.